Welcome to Virtual Virtue Ethics. I confess I will not be starting a blog or any other video conferencing activity. Talking to you is really nice. Talking to this computer, not so much. I wish that we could be together and carry on with our studies. However, we'll try to make the best of the current technology. So, it's been weeks since last we saw each other. How about we do a quick recap of where we are in the course? The course, as I designed it, has three chief parts. Part one, we were looking at virtues. Part two, we were looking at what ties those together and what the nature of virtue is. And part three, which is what we're about to turn our attention to, is concerned with virtue ethics. So, by way of recollection, we started off thinking about traits that we recognize in the people around us, in virtue of which we admire them. And we listed a whole bunch of those on the opening day. Some of those included honesty, tolerance, generosity, loyalty, responsibility, courage, wisdom, and humility. We carried on with our list making, identifying fairness, kindness, vulnerability, curiosity, creativity. And then for the next few classes, we looked in detail at the three virtues that sit here in the bottom right of your screen, namely meekness, ambition, and contentment. You've subsequently gone off and added to this list by writing interesting essays on a range of other virtues, some of which appear here and some of which, like patriotism, might be subsets of virtues that appear here, or some that might be distinctive to themselves. I'm sorry I don't yet have your essays back to you. I'm aiming to get them back by the end of this week. The strike threw a bit of a spanner into the works, but we should be there soon. So when you've got a list like this, one of the questions that we ask as philosophers is the question that Plato encouraged us to ask, namely, is there anything that these very different traits might have in common? If we look at things that appear to be different, are there ways in which they might be similar? And that's what our accounts of virtue are exploring. One of the accounts of virtue that we've seen just in passing is the kind of theory that builds on Aristotle's insight that a virtue is an excellent trait of character, and instead of trying to identify some set of metaphysical qualities that would make that virtue the thing it is, instead, Linda Zagzebski has pointed to a set of epistemological considerations. So she says, let's look around at the people that we see and say, yep, that person's virtuous, and work with our intuitive understanding of who does and who doesn't count as standing out as excellent. Her approach, the exemplarist account of virtue, works from that thought that a virtue is a constituent trait of paradigmatically good persons. And the way we then can proceed is by finding people who fit that description, who stand out as paradigmatically good, and looking then at the qualities they possess in virtue of which we admire them. The way that Zagzebski fills in then her characterization of virtue is that a virtue is a trait that makes an exemplar admirable. Okay, that tells us how we identify people who are going to be virtuous, and doesn't tell us much, if anything, about the metaphysics of virtue. What is it that we're recognizing in them? And is there anything that we're recognizing in them that really ties together all of the different kinds of things that we call virtues? The quickest and easiest answer to that question that says, yes, there is something that ties them together, is offered by Julia Driver in her account of virtue consequentialism. So you'll remember that she takes a moral virtue to be a character trait, which she describes as either a disposition or a cluster of dispositions, which generally speaking produces good consequences for others. There is one moving piece or part in her story, namely whether or not it benefits others. The flip side of virtue consequentialism might be the kind of theory that we get with eudaimonism. So Rosalind Hursthouse, whom we've seen a couple of times heretofore, suggests that a virtue is a character trait a human being needs for eudaimonia, to flourish or to live well. The focus of the eudaimonist story is not that it's a trait that benefits others, rather it's that it's a trait that is good for you. What kind of good for you? Well, Hursthouse suggests, one, it benefits you, and two, quite importantly, it is what you need in order to be a good human being. So the kinds of benefits aren't just accidental benefits that have nothing to do with the kind of creature we are. Instead, the kind of benefits we're concerned with are the sorts of things that we need to live well, the kind of life we're capable of living. And to fill in that second part, what Hursthouse reaches for is her account of naturalism. We identify the kind of species we are, and we then look at the kinds of qualities we need to have in order to flourish as members of that species. A third account of virtue that we've seen in passing is the one that's offered by David Hume. So Hume brings together the best of both the virtue consequentialist and the eudaimonist, in a sense, by suggesting that a virtue is a quality of mind or character that is useful or agreeable to oneself or to others, and is approved upon reflection. So he's not just interested in things that are beneficial to myself in the way that the eudaimonist sets up the story, or that are beneficial to others in the way that Driver's virtue consequentialism is designed. Instead, he's interested in things that are going to be beneficial both to oneself and to others. But an added feature of Hume's account is his characterization of what's going to count as beneficial. One way that something can be beneficial is it can be useful. It's the case that being hardworking is a useful trait for somebody to have. Another way, however, that we might pick out something that gets our tick of approval is if it's what he calls immediately agreeable. The trait of cheerfulness fits this description. Hume suggests that although cheerfulness is useful for lots of different purposes, the thing that really stands out about it is it's just really nice to be around somebody who's cheerful. They're good company, they're pleasant to be in the room with. And so what we have on Hume's story are two different kinds of qualities that can overlap but needn't be present in every case, that help explain what tie together the vast range of qualities that we identified at the outset and explain why all of them count as virtues. Merely being useful to someone or agreeable to someone, however, is not yet enough. Hume thinks that usefulness or agreeableness needs to be something that we endorse upon reflection. It can be useful for me to betray your trust, and my duplicity might enable me to engage in that activity usefully. However, upon reflection, we're not going to give duplicity a tick of approval. So we need those three things together. We need that it's useful or agreeable. We need that it's one of those things either to myself or to somebody else. And we need that it's something that we approve on reflection. The most complicated story, or the story at least with the most moving pieces and parts that we've looked at so far, is the story about virtue that Philippa Foot tells us. Like everybody else, she starts off with the thought that a virtue is a disposition which is beneficial either to oneself or to others. Like Hume, she's combining both self and other in the story. What she adds, which Hume would be happy with, is that it's a matter of one's will. What she means by it being a matter of one's will, we talked about at some length earlier in the term, but it picks out the kinds of things we care about as well as the kinds of decisions that we make. One of the distinctive features of Foot's account is that she suggests virtues are corrective. That is, they stand at a place where we're naturally tempted to fall short in some way, or where where there's a deficiency of motivation on our part to do good. So courage stands, as it does, as a contrary to and a corrective of our excessive fearfulness. And hope stands as a corrective to our temptation to excessive despair. For adds to the corrective nature that it's also difficult for us to embody the kinds of dispositions that we call virtues. If a disposition is something that comes naturally to more or less everyone, then we don't typically refer to it as a virtue. A virtue is, to call something a virtue is to use a term of praise in reference to it. It's an excellence, not just an averageness. So in that sense, we're interested in traits that are not just beneficial and a matter of one's will and corrective, but they're also excellent. That is, they're things that not everybody can do without effort. And that brings us to the last feature of her account. It's not only the case that they're excellent, they're practical excellence, the kind of excellence that leads us to act in one way or another, and care in one way or another, and be one way rather than another. So those are the first two parts of the course. Now to the third part. The third part is asking, okay, so we've seen what virtues are like. Choose one of the theories that we've just been talking about. And we're now wanting to ask what we do with that. How do we put that together with other things, or how do we build out of the resources that virtue makes available to us to get to a theory that offers us practical guidance on what we should do and when we should do it, how we should be, and how one goes about becoming that kind of being. That's what virtue ethics is designed to do. The assumption that the virtue ethicist today is working with is that there are broadly three families of normative theory. There are deontological theories, there are consequentialist theories, and there are virtue ethical theories. Had you come on the scene in your philosophical education about 60 years ago, you would have gotten lots of versions of the first and the second, but the third probably wouldn't have been discussed as a distinctive option. If virtues got mentioned at all, they would have gotten mentioned in the context of a deontological theory or a consequentialist theory. Because, as you'll remember, there was this period of time beginning in the 19th century and going through much of the 20th century when deontological theories and consequentialist theories dominated the stage and virtue ethical theories were forgotten. What's distinctive about a deontological theory? Well, deontological theories have to do with duties of one sort or another. They're concerned with oughts and ought nots, do's and don'ts. They pick out obligations. And one familiar example of a theory that has this kind of structure is represented for us in the collection of commandments from the Hebrew book of Exodus. The 10 Commandments: you shall have no other gods before me, you shall not make any graven images, honor your father and mother, you shall not kill, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal. They're a collection of obligations that individuals have. And a deontological theory that's built around divine commands will look at all of the commands that have been given by the deity, collect all of those together in a nice long do and don't list, and we'll then need to learn the list and figure out how to apply those moral principles. But the divine command theory isn't the only kind of deontological theory on the market. Another really familiar kind of deontological theory is a Kantian theory. On the Kantian story, there's something that ties together all of those do's and don'ts, besides just the fact that they were commanded by a divine agent. He thinks that what ties them all together is that they all satisfy in one way or another what he calls the categorical imperative. He gives different formulations of the categorical imperative. Those of you who took the Kant and Hume course at Junior Honors will be familiar with lots of those formulations. But for today, let's just focus on the first formulation he gives us, the formula of universal law. Kant suggests that the thing that ties together the various moral principles that we have, or the obligations we have, is that they all satisfy this condition that one is acting, when acting on them, in accordance with a maxim through which you can, at the same time, will that it become a universal law. So you consider a moral principle that you might act on. You ask, could I take that principle and wish that it held like gravity holds, so that every time somebody found themselves in a circumstance like the one I'm facing now, they would be forced to act on it as if by a law of nature. If I could consistently will that the world were designed in that way, then the principle in question is an acceptable principle. And the action that I'm performing is, in some sense, a right action. Deontological theories are built around the idea of a duty or an obligation. Consequentialist theories don't ignore duties and obligations, but the thing that does the heavy lifting for them is going to be the consequences or the outcomes of whatever the action or the rule or the trait of character, depending on the kind of consequentialist story we're talking about, whatever the consequences are of that thing holding true. So the most familiar version of consequentialism will be the act utilitarianism that we get out of John Stuart Mill. We'll leave aside for a moment the question of whether the best interpretation of Mill is as a rule consequentialist or an act consequentialist. There's a lively debate among Mill scholars on that front, but we'll ignore that for right now and just give the act consequentialist reading. On the act consequentialist reading, which is invited by Mill himself, we're going to see an action as right in proportion as it tends to promote happiness, and wrong as it tends to promote the reverse of happiness to the whole sentient creation. What's interesting about the consequentialist story in its utilitarian version is it gives us a story about rightness, not in terms of a moral principle, but instead in terms of a set of consequences that will be brought about as a result of the action that I perform. And the kinds of consequences that Mill is interested in particular, are happiness and unhappiness. But that's what's distinctive about utilitarian versions of consequentialism. There are other versions of consequentialism, and they needn't go in for the hedonism that Bentham endorsed or that Mill modified. So the most general characterization of act consequentialism would be this. Actions are right if and only if they produce, on balance, good consequences. They're wrong if and only if they produce, on balance, bad consequences. So here's our question. In light of deontological theories and consequentialist theories giving us a story about what we should do and how we should act, can the virtue ethicist give us a comparable story based on a different set of starting assumptions that aren't just interested in the rules that we might follow, nor just interested in the consequences that might follow from our acting in a particular way? If we can, then we can come up with something that might be a distinctive kind of normative theory that we might call virtue ethics. If we cannot, then we may end up rolling our virtue discussion into a broader consequentialist framework or a deontological framework instead. To answer the question whether there is a third form of ethics, namely virtue ethics, Hursthouse invites us to look at the structure of deontological and consequentialist theories. She thinks that if we look at that structure, we'll notice some similarities between both of those theories. And she's going to argue that we can mirror that structure using virtue concepts in a central role and generate a distinctive kind of theory that is a virtue ethical theory. So what's the structure that we're looking at when we're thinking about deontology? Well, Hursthouse suggests that a deontological theory starts with an opening assumption. That opening assumption is that an act is right if and only if it's in accordance with a moral rule or principle. That's going to be an assumption that ties together the vast range of different deontological theories. The divine command theorists and the Kantians and other objective list theorists and natural law theorists will all be in agreement that an action is right if and only if it's in accordance with a moral rule or principle. The place where they'll differ from one another is on their identification of the rules or principles that we need to follow. And so we'll add to our opening assumption a second assumption, and the second assumption does the distinguishing work between the different kinds of deontologists. So a moral rule is one that is laid on us by God, the divine command theorist will say. Or a moral rule is one that is required by natural law, someone like Grotius will say. Or a moral rule, Kant might argue, is laid on us by reason, or would be the object of choice of all rational beings. Kant will endorse both of those latter two claims. The thing that's distinctive about these two premises is that they help us forge a conceptual link between two different sets of concepts. The first premise helps us link the concept of right action with the concept of a moral rule. It tells us how we should understand what a right action is in terms of a set of rules that we're going to follow. And the second premise is going to forge a conceptual link for us between a moral rule and rationality, or a divine command. So we get from right action to the divine command by way of the moral rule, which is the intermediary between these two separate concepts. How about the consequentialist? Well, focusing on act utilitarianism for the sake of simplicity, the act utilitarian is going to start off with an opening premise that says an act is right if and only if it promotes the best consequences. And then what will distinguish the range of different consequentialist theories from one another is how they fill in their account of the best consequences. So an action is right if and only if it promotes the best consequences, forges a conceptual link between right action and best consequences. And then the best consequences will be those in which, in the case of the act utilitarian, happiness is maximized. If instead we were going for some non-hedonic story about best consequences, then we'll have to explain how we identify the different kinds of things that count as good consequences in terms of some concept other than happiness. But in the utilitarian version, what we get is a link between best consequences and maximal happiness. So we start off with right action, we link right action or understand right action in terms of best consequences, and then we understand best consequences in terms of maximal happiness. That gets us a link then between right action and what promotes maximal happiness. Once we notice that act utilitarianism and other forms of consequentialism and various forms of deontology have these kinds of structures where we've got an opening premise and then a second premise that starts to fill in the details, we can notice that we get a similar sort of structure that can emerge if we substitute virtue concepts instead of consequence concepts or moral rule or principle concepts. So using the same structural motif, our opening assumption in constructing a virtue ethic might be the following. An action is right if and only if it is what the virtuous agent would do in the circumstances. Part of what this opening premise does is it forges a conceptual link between right action and a virtuous agent. Notice that the link is between right action and an agent, not virtuous action. You might go that route as well. So say that an action is right if and only if it's a virtuous action. and then spell out what a virtuous action is in some other way. But Hursthouse hasn't taken that route. She's gone from right action to the actions of a virtuous agent. So we need to understand something about what virtuous agents are like in order to get a virtue ethical theory of her sort up and running. Because she makes that link with the virtuous agent, her theory is what is called a qualified agent theory. There are other forms that a virtue ethic might take, but the form that Hursthouse is giving us is one that invites us to look at an agent who's really good at making choices. And then we make choices in a way that is in some way modeled on what they would do. It's a structure that should be familiar to us because there are a number of people who have worked on moral principles or at least memorable moral motifs that have had this kind of structure. So that one might ask, in trying to decide what to do, what would Jesus do? Or one might ask, in trying to decide what to do, what would Socrates do? Or what would Gandhi do? Or what would Martin Luther King Jr. do? Or what would Nelson Mandela do? Choose your moral hero. The structure of a theory like this invites us to identify that kind of moral hero and think about what they might do. In that sense, there is a similarity between the exemplarist story and the qualified agent story. The exemplarist story, you'll remember, asks us to pick out paradigmatically good persons and notice the kinds of traits those persons have. The qualified agent story is inviting us to do the same kind of thing. But it's going to fill in some more details that the exemplarist story might not necessarily fill in. So although they go part of the way together, they won't go all the way together. What extra details are going to be filled in by the qualified agent theorist? Well, one of those details will be a subordinate clause under this opening premise, which is going to give us a link between a virtuous agent and the virtues. So a virtuous agent is one who acts virtuously, that is, one who has and who exercises the virtues. That gives us a little more guidance than what we had at the outset, where we're just looking at virtuous agents, in part because we're not just interested in any old thing virtuous agents would do. A virtuous agent might, if the lobe of his right ear was itchy, reach up and itch his ear. But that doesn't give us any guidance as to whether we ought to itch our right ear, particularly in light of the kind of guidance we're getting right now around COVID-19 telling us not to touch our faces. So we're interested in a subset of the kinds of things that a virtuous agent is going to be doing. The subset we're interested in is the subset that is picked out by the virtues. So we'll add to the opening premise, together with its subordinate clause, a second premise. A virtue is a character trait that a human being needs to flourish or to live well. Notice what this does. It draws a conceptual link between virtue on the one hand and flourishing on the other. So the structure of the virtue ethical account that we've got goes from right action to virtuous agent, understanding right actions in terms of the actions of virtuous agents. It then goes from virtuous agents to virtues, inviting us to understand the bit of virtuous agents' actions that we care about as the virtue bit. And then it draws a connection between virtues and human flourishing. This is, of course, the eudaimonist version of a virtue ethic. Other versions of a virtue ethic, like the one that we'll see from Christine Swanton in another couple of days, won't draw the connection by way of eudaimonism, but this gives us at least an idea of how one might develop a form of virtue ethics, specifically by appealing to flourishing to help us figure out what kinds of things we would do. So in each of the three kinds of theories that we're looking at here, we have an opening claim that tells us something structural and something interesting, but doesn't give us heaps of guidance. So an action is right if and only if it's in accordance with a moral rule or principle in the deontologist case, or an action is right if and only if it is going to promote the best consequences in the case of the consequentialist, and an action is right if and only if it's what the virtuous agent would do in the circumstances, we can get some guidance from each of those things. But to deal with the complexities of day-to-day choosing, we're going to need more details. And the second premise is designed to help us get additional details. We find out that the principles we're interested in are the ones recommended by reason or the ones commanded by God. And then we go through all of the things recommended by reason and all the things commanded by God and see which of those apply to our particular context of action, and then we can follow that rule that stands out amongst all of those. Similarly with consequences, we can look at all the consequences of the action and we unpack which consequences we're interested in terms perhaps of the happiness and unhappiness they might cause. And then having weighed up all of the happiness and unhappiness that might result from the range of actions, we pursue the one that maximizes happiness while minimizing unhappiness. So goes the act consequentialist story. And then we start off with the generic observation that we're looking for virtuous agents, and we look around at various virtuous agents, but we don't just have to look at those agents. We can look at particular qualities and start to spell out our story in more detail as a result of looking at those particular qualities, which will then give us guidance on whether or not we are acting well or badly. And the qualities that are going to emerge and are being recommended for our consideration are the ones that are going to contribute to human flourishing. Okay, so now to some reservations someone might express with respect to the kind of theory that Hursthouse had advanced. One of the objections that has been raised against virtue ethics is that the notion of eudaimonia is hopelessly obscure. It's broad, it's vague. How do we figure out what human flourishing consists in? And if we can't figure out what human flourishing consists in, well, then how could this possibly afford us any guidance at all when trying to decide what we should do with our lives? Never mind what we should do in the next 2 minutes. Hursthouse, however, isn't overly moved by this concern. Why not? Well, one reason she's not overly concerned is that it doesn't look like it's on any different footing than the key concepts that are present in the deontological or the consequentialist framework. The deontologist is making reference to rationality, at least the deontologist of the Kantian form. The consequentialist of Mill's variety is making reference to happiness. What's happiness and what's rationality? Those look like they're just as complicated a question as what human flourishing is. So in that sense, each of these theories is making an appeal to a big, broad concept, and the devil will be in the details when we turn our attention to unpacking the nature of that concept. No theory is going to be in any different position with respect to that quandary, and we shouldn't expect them to be. After all, our characterization of each of these theories has just consisted in 1 or 2 sentences. We shouldn't expect a single or double sentence descriptor to capture for us all of the nuance that we want in our normative theory. A second objection that has been raised against virtue ethical theories is that such theories are trivially circular, defining right action in terms of the virtuous agent and defining the virtuous agent in terms of right action. Now, there might be somebody who has done this, but none of the virtue ethicists that are currently on the market is engaged in this kind of foolishness. Everybody who's offering what they take to be a virtue ethical account is giving us a story about the virtues that they think doesn't just smuggle right action in through the back door. There are some who have resisted this. Roger Crisp, in the penultimate reading assigned for the course, suggests that virtue ethicists like Aristotle are in fact smuggling some notion of rightness in under the cover of night to which they're not entitled. So there may be some version of this objection that goes through. If you're persuaded by Crisp, you'll think so. If you're not persuaded by Crisp, then you don't need to be worried about that. But the thing to notice, at least on the face of it, is that the eudaimonist doesn't look like they're susceptible to this kind of worry. because the eudaemonist is defining virtuous agents not in terms of right actions, but in terms of the virtues. And they're defining the virtues in terms of what human beings need in order to flourish, that is, in terms of eudaimonia. And neither of those two things look like they immediately boil back down to a list of right actions or moral principles. So it's not clear that the circularity objection applies, but if it does apply, it's not going to apply in an obvious or trivial or superficial sort of way. A lot of work will need to be done in order to make that kind of objection stick, because on the face of it, the eudaemonist looks like they're not susceptible to it. A third objection that has been raised against virtue ethics is taking its cue from a really important paper by Elizabeth Anscombe that suggests that modern moral philosophy is deeply confused, that its obsession with right action is in fact rooted in a historical appeal to something like a divine command theory or a law-giving theory. And if you take laws and divine commanders out of the account in the way that most contemporary moral theorists do, then what are you left with? Anscombe suggests you're left with nonsense. And she invites us to turn to virtue ethical traditions because they give us a whole bunch of concepts other than rightness or duties or obligations for us to work with to still figure out how we can live better and worse lives. So someone like Anscombe might suggest that the question that the virtue ethicist really should be answering is, what sort of person should I be? And the answer will be, I should be a virtuous person. But the theorists that we've been talking about, namely the deontologist and the consequentialist, they're interested in, what should I do? What's the right course of action? And so, insofar as the virtue ethicist is concerned with the first question, not the second, they're not really answering the same question that the other two theories are answering, and thus they're not a competitor to a deontologist or a consequentialist. But insofar as an acceptable moral theory really should be able to answer the question, what should I do? They need to be able to answer that. And if they're not, well, then so much the worse for them. Not only are they not a competing answer, they're an incomplete normative theory. There are two ways that one might respond to this objection. They boil down to rejecting A or rejecting B. You might reject the claim that virtue ethics is just concerned with the question, what sort of person should I be, and doesn't answer the question, what should I do? That's the route that Hursthouse takes. Or you might, like Anscombe and company, accept that it's concerned with what sort of person should I be, and reject the claim that an acceptable moral theory needs to answer the question, what should I do, precisely because you think that question has been badly formed in one way or another. But either route is available to the virtue ethicist. So it doesn't look as though objection 3 goes through, at least not straightforwardly and without additional argument. A fourth objection is that appealing to the virtuous agent offers vague guidance. After all, as I'm trying to decide what exactly I should do in light of the fact that classes are no longer being held on campus, and I'm concerned about offering the right kind of teaching content to all of you, if I ask, what would Socrates do? It's not clear that I'm going to end up on Zoom making a video that I'll upload to Moodle, if only because Socrates didn't have computers or Zoom or Moodle to work with. So we might worry that the kind of guidance we get out of the qualified agent theory either won't apply to our circumstances or will be too nebulous or too vague for us to be able to actually get positive direction from it. However, Hursthouse has a nice rejoinder to this. She points out that we don't just appeal to the virtuous agent. We unpack what the virtuous agent is in terms of the virtues. And those give us a fair amount of guidance. So we can come up with a set of rules based on that. We should be kind. That's how I answer the question, what should I do? I should do the kind thing, or I should be generous, or be honest, or be industrious, or be fair. I can also appeal to the vices and negate those. I should not be cruel. I should not be gluttonous. I should not be cowardly. What we get out of the V rules, the virtue and vice rules, is a lot of concrete guidance. Of course, we'll need to do some extra spade work to figure out what the nature of kindness is or what the nature of generosity is. Exactly the kind of work that you were doing in your first essay, before we can get the detailed guidance that helps us in complicated situations. And we'll also need to think about how each of these different virtues might relate to one another. And we'll need a story about how we can weave them together. Nevertheless, the claim that the guidance we get is just vague won't go through once we start to get those extra details on the table. A fifth objection is that different cultures have different virtues. And if we're taking a virtue ethical approach and we're appealing to the virtues that we find present in our cultural context or in some other cultural context, won't that lead us to one of the following three things? Won't it lead us to either skepticism, well, they say this and those other people say that, forget it all, nobody knows what they're talking about? Or might it not lead us to relativism? Well, what they take to be a virtue is good for them, and what somebody else takes to be a virtue is good for them. And if they end up in disagreements with one another, well, we can only answer those by appeal to the kind of cultural context in which the speaker is situated. Or at the very least, even if it doesn't lead us to skepticism or relativism, won't it lead us to pluralism, where we end up with lots of different accounts of virtue which don't necessarily harmonize with one another? Hursthouse's response to this is first to note that pluralism's okay. Having a complicated story is a good thing, most virtue ethicists think. It's one of the complaints that they have consistently raised against consequentialists, is that they think consequentialists have tried to oversimplify the nature of what we should do and how we should be, and we need more complex tools to really figure it out in day-to-day contexts. A second move that the virtue ethicist can make is to say, not only is complexity good, which gives us a leg up on the consequentialist, but it looks as though the other competing theory, namely the deontological theory, will be in exactly the same boat. Culture A says, these are the moral rules. Culture B says, those are the moral rules. We've got the complexities that emerge and invite either skepticism or relativism or pluralism for the deontologist every bit as much as it does for the virtue ethicist. So at the very least, the virtue ethicist isn't any further behind on this particular point. What we need, in addition to the structure of a virtue ethical account, is a story about the nature of moral facts or moral truths. In other words, we need something that helps us address the error theorist and the relativist and the like. That invites us to move out of normative ethical space into meta-ethical space. It shouldn't be surprising to us that the normative ethical theory doesn't answer this particular meta-ethical problem about realism and anti-realism. However, there is at least one dimension of a virtue ethical story that might help us speak to some of these concerns and help us notice that the virtue ethicist need not be committed to relativism merely in virtue of being a virtue ethicist. And that's spelled out in some detail in the paper by Martha Nussbaum that you read a couple of weeks ago. So you'll remember that Nussbaum invites us to think about spheres of action that are going to crop up for any member of Homo sapiens. Social animals that we are, with the emotional and relational and physical proclivities that we have, will run into certain spheres of concern. Those will include our experiences of fear in the face of danger and or in the absence of danger, our bodily appetites, our limited resources, the things that we do with the stuff that we hold near and dear, or the things that we own. It will include our sense of our own worth and our attitudes towards others who may not share our sense of our own worth and may act in ways that undermine or conflict with that sense of our worth. We'll need to figure out lots of other details about how we coordinate our lives together in virtue of being social animals with an extended childhood of dependence on other human beings that doesn't entirely go away even in adulthood, as we're finding out in the midst of our isolation in this pandemic. We're still dependent on lots of other people to get our food to the stores where we can go and pick it up, and on doctors to look after those of us who have gotten sick and the like. And so we need to figure out how we organize our lives together. All members of Homo sapiens will also need to figure out what to do with their intellectual sphere, how to organize their intellectual lives, and how to plan not just this moment or that corner of life, but how to plan their life as a whole. All of these spheres are going to be spheres that any human being in any context is going to need to deal with, Nussbaum argues. And if we look at those spheres, we can notice that there are virtues that are lined up to help us deal with the challenges that arise in respect to each of those domains. So, with respect to fear, the virtue that's going to help us navigate fear spaces will be the virtue of courage. With respect to bodily appetites, it's temperance. With respect to limited resources, we're thinking about justice. And when it comes to personal property, we're reflecting on generosity and that subset of generosity that is known as hospitality, that invites others into our home spaces in order to share things with them. With attitudes toward our own worth, we have the virtue that Aristotle calls megalopsychia, or greatness of soul. With respect to slights, we have mildness of temper or meekness. With respect to living together, we have the virtues of honesty and friendliness. Our intellectual life will include things like perceptiveness and open-mindedness and intellectual humility and the like. And when it comes to planning our lives, we have the virtue of practical wisdom. The upshot is, Nussbaum argues, we don't need to think that relativism is more worrisome for the virtue ethicist than anybody else. And in fact, we've got a really nice story that the virtue ethicist can tell to help set aside relativist worries and notice the universality that we might find across cultural divides in our normative claims. That's not going to eliminate all of the features that are distinctive to one cultural context as opposed to another. Nevertheless, it gives us a kind of core stability and gives us space to reflect on differences between cultural contexts where we think one of them might have gotten it right and the other one has missed the boat. So what we can get out of a framework like this is a thin definition of virtue, which says a virtue is whatever it is that being disposed to choose and respond well consists in that sphere. So we look at our sphere, we look at people who handle that sphere well, we look at the dispositions they have, and those dispositions are going to be the ones that we pick out as the virtues. We can add to this a conception of virtuous action, which will be defined in terms of appropriate functioning in each human sphere. We can then point to a traditional definition of virtue, the kind of thing that we might get by reading through Confucius's works, or the works of Mencius, or the works of Aristotle and Plato, or wherever, which will be a specification of the disposition that governs a particular sphere. This is what respect for your parents or honor for your elders looks like, says Confucius. And he spells out then for us what it is that this trait should do when it's possessed by somebody. And we then can reflect on that traditional characterization of virtue and decide whether we think he's got it right or not, which can lead us to a thick definition of virtue, which is the correct specification of the disposition that governs a particular sphere. The virtue ethicist, Nussbaum contends, has all the resources she needs in order to be able to dispel the relativist's worry. How about objection 6? Objection 6 claims that because of conflicts between the demands of different virtues, virtue ethicists have an unresolvable conflict built into their theories. So imagine that the person you love most has just been shoplifting and you've noticed their shoplifting. Justice demands that others are given their due, and the shop owner needs to be given the money that she's owed for the item your beloved has just lifted and put in their pocket. But your love for them wants things to go well for them, and being busted for shoplifting doesn't usually lead to things going well, at least in the near term. Maybe in the long term, it will teach them a lesson, but there are less painful ways that lesson might be learned. And even if it's the best way for them to learn the lesson, you don't want them to suffer pain. And so your charity or your compassion for them will resist your disclosing to the shop owner that they've stolen this item. So we'll get a straightforward conflict between your proclivity to justice and your proclivity to compassion. These two dispositions that you've been habituated into and have developed over the years will be pulling in opposing directions. That's the worry. Hursthous's response is to note that, once again, the virtue ethicist is in exactly the same boat as the deontologist. Deontologists will have lots of different rules, and there's no guarantee that all of those rules will line up. That just means that our ethical decisions are open to dilemmas. We'll need to have ways of helping us sort through dilemmas, and a complete moral theory will help us reflect on those ways and try and reduce some of the dilemmas that we face. But we shouldn't expect a moral theory to get rid of all dilemmas, because moral life is complicated. Hursthouse herself doesn't say this, but we might add that a similar worry can be raised for the consequentialist, because most consequentialists have more than one kind of good in play. Returning to John Stuart Mill, Mill suggests that even though he's concerned with happiness, there are different kinds of happiness. There is the happiness that we can experience in common with any other animal. So the pleasure that we experience as a result of tasting a ripe feijoa fruit is a pleasure that my dog could also enjoy if given the opportunity. But in addition to the kinds of pleasures that I share with my dog, there are also higher order pleasures, the kind of pleasure that comes from wrestling with an intellectual puzzle and then having a breakthrough and figuring it out, or the pleasure that comes with being able to articulate a point clearly and convincingly so as to change the opinion of your audience regarding some important question. Those are pleasures that our dogs and cats and other domesticated animals or animals in the wild don't experience. And Mill goes on to suggest that those higher order pleasures, the kinds of happiness that are concerned with our intellectual and social lives, are more valuable, weightier than the kinds of pleasures that we share in common with other animals. That means that we can find ourselves in contexts where there's a conflict between a higher order form of happiness and a lower order form of happiness. And when they pull in opposing directions, then the consequentialist too will end up with a conflict. Even for a theory that doesn't have different kinds of goods that are incommensurable, that can't just be translated in a single currency, your typical consequentialist is still going to have a problem. Take someone like Bentham, who doesn't go for different kinds of pleasure. He thinks he's talking about just a single thing, pleasure, and that we can just measure it in terms of quantities. Even for Bentham, there are going to be contexts where you've got conflicting tensions. If I make choice A, then I maximize the pleasure for a small group of people. If I make choice B, a smaller amount of pleasure will be enjoyed by a wide group of people. Insofar as maximizing the quantity of pleasure and the distribution of pleasure are two different factors, you can get conflicts between these two different factors when a single choice contingently doesn't permit us to maximize both the quantity and the distribution. So the mere fact that we can get conflicts between different features of our theory doesn't look like it makes virtue ethics any different than any other normative theory. Does the virtue ethicist need to help us think through those kinds of cases and reduce the number of them? Absolutely. As I said before, that's part of developing a normative theory. But merely working your theory around virtues doesn't put you in a worse spot in this respect than any other normative theory that looks like a plausible candidate. Now to our seventh objection. Virtue ethics does not provide a decision procedure that can be followed by any reasonably intelligent agent, says the objector. Hursthous's response to this is, you're absolutely right. And that's a feature, not a bug, because no adequate moral theory offers a decision procedure. If you want an account that just allows you to plug and play without any thought or reflection, without the development of practical wisdom, without efforts on your part to habituate yourself to care about the right kinds of things and to formulate courses of action that would enable you to promote the goods that are involved in those things, well, then you're looking for something that isn't available to you in a moral theory that's really worth its salt. Why? Because living well requires wisdom, and that's not something that's susceptible to a decision procedure. An eighth objection is that virtue concepts such as charity presuppose concepts such as the good and the worthwhile, and so on. The thought behind this objection is that maybe the virtue ethicist is smuggling a concept in under the cover of night to which she hasn't legitimately been entitled, because she hasn't built into her theory an account of goodness or an account of worth that itself doesn't depend on a concept of virtue. And thus, she's either giving us a rather important piece in her theory that she hasn't accounted for at all, or she's giving us a piece that in fact would enable you to reduce the appearance of virtue in the virtue ethical theory to something else, so that ultimately some other factor is doing the real work. So how might the virtue ethicist respond to this concern? Well, one response, the one that Hursthouse favors, is that the kinds of concepts of the good that we're interested in, or that the virtue ethicist needs to draw on, can be provided by eudaimonia. If the naturalist project goes through that Hursthouse and Foote are engaged in, then we can appeal to Aristotelian necessities, which are just determined by the kind of species we're part of. We could figure out what goodness is in terms of the kinds of qualities that we need in order to flourish as members of the species we belong to. A second kind of response that might be offered comes from the earlier paper by Foote that we read right at the start of the semester, the one about virtues and utilitarianism, which was suggesting that a consequentialist is telling us that we ought to do the thing that brings about a good state of affairs, which seems really attractive. But before we can figure out what to do, we have to know what a good state of affairs is. And to answer that question, you'll remember, Foote argues we have to take up the standpoint of the virtue of benevolence. So at the end of the process, she wants to say we can in fact get our conception of goodness out of our conception of virtue, rather than the other way around. Virtue then wouldn't smuggle in concepts to which it wasn't entitled. The objection would be against the consequentialist instead, that they're smuggling in concepts to which they're not entitled. A third option would be that you could just take goodness and worthwhileness to be independent normative concepts. They could be like maximizing is and happiness is for the utilitarian. That there's nothing about the structure of a consequentialist story that spells out for us what the nature of happiness is. We need some other account of happiness and its goodness to get the consequentialist project off the ground in the first place. If that's the case, then it looks as though any of the normative theories will have some room for independent concepts to be brought into the account. A theory, in other words, to be a deontological theory, needn't boil everything down to just one single concept, and similarly for the virtue ethicist. As long as virtue concepts, at the end of the day, are not reducible to these other normative concepts like rightness or goodness, then the fact that there are other normative concepts in the account just needn't be a problem for the virtue ethicist. A ninth objection that Hursthouse canvasses is that virtue ethics tries to define all moral concepts in terms of the virtuous agent. So unlike the previous objection, which said the virtue ethicist is borrowing ideas to which it's not entitled, this objection says the virtue ethicist tries to take everything, every concept out there, and reduce it to some relation to a virtuous agent. And so goes the objection, that's implausible. Surely we can have an understanding of obligations without making an appeal to the virtuous agent, etc. Hursthouse's response to this is going to be different from some virtue ethicists. Some virtue ethicists will say, absolutely, yes, I'm trying to define all moral concepts in terms of the virtuous agent. However, Hursthouse and most virtue ethicists don't make that move. Hursthouse makes an even bolder claim, suggesting no virtue theorist who takes her inspiration from Aristotle would even contemplate aiming at reductionism. So if you're engaged in that game, trying to get everything down to one normative variable, well, then you've already started on a different kind of project than the progenitor of virtue ethics was engaged in. Why? Well, because in contrast to at least the consequentialist and deontological theories of the 20th century, the virtue ethicist has been trying to expand the range of normative concepts that we make use of, encouraging us to use more rather than less. They think the reductionist project has run away with itself, and we ought to have an account that enables us to gain access to things like motives and traits of character, as well as consequences and obligations, and that enables us to grab hold of thicker concepts like that something is funny or pitiful or cruel or in some other way suspicious. That doesn't just boil down to good or bad, right or wrong. And insofar as the virtue ethicist is looking to expand the range of factors that we draw on, the objection that we're considering doesn't look all that forceful. So what can we say? To this point, the virtue ethicist has a response to each of the objections that we've looked at. But I want to raise at least a concern, not for virtue ethics as a whole, but now for the particular way in which Hursthouse has carved up the space. It's a question that will invite us to reflect more fully on the relationship between virtue ethics and some other normative theories in our next lecture. The objection starts from the observation that at least the characterization of deontology that Hursthouse has offered us looks as though it's going to cast the net a little too widely. Why is it casting the net too widely? Well, because it looks like it includes a form of consequentialism, specifically rule consequentialism, right? So the rule consequentialist will say an action is right if and only if it's in accordance with a moral rule or principle. It's just that it's going to spell out what count as the moral rules in terms of those rules which the general observation of which will produce best consequences for us. So what we get from the schematic characterization Hursthouse offers is something that doesn't just include straightforwardly deontological theories, it also includes a form of consequentialism. Similarly, what we get from the characterization of the structure of virtue ethics will allow us to get virtue consequentialism in the story as well. Because the virtue consequentialist can agree that an action is right if and only if it's what the virtuous agent would do in the circumstances, and can agree that a virtuous agent is one who acts virtuously, that is, one who has and exercises the virtues, where the virtue consequentialist parts ways is not in that broader structure, but in the second premise where they define what a virtue is. Because there they'll say a virtue is a character trait whose possession generally produces good consequences. If that's the case, then it at least invites us to wonder whether Hursthouse has drawn the lines in the right place in distinguishing between the deontologist, the consequentialist, and the virtue ethicist. Neither of these observations gives us reason to think a virtue ethicist isn't offering a distinctive form of theory. All they do is invite us to wonder whether the way the differences have been characterized is adequate to help us put all of the things that are consequentialist theories in a single basket, and all of the things that are deontological theories in a single basket, and all of the things that are virtue ethical theories in a single basket, rather than a schema that has put one form of consequentialist theory in the deontologist's camp and one form of consequentialist theory in the virtue ethical camp, when in fact neither one belongs in those camps. So to reflect more fully on that kind of question and how we might carve up the landscape to distinguish between a virtue ethic and other forms of moral theory, we'll turn our attention to Gary Watson and to Jorge Gracia in our next lecture. All right, that's the end of our time together now. What I'm going to invite you to do is to read Watson and read Gracia for next time, and then the following lecture, I'll plan to talk about Swanton and about Raman Das and some of the objections that have been raised to virtue ethical accounts. In the meantime, take care of yourselves, stay well, avoid passing germs to other people to the extent that you can. I'm not terribly concerned about any of your health insofar as most of you are in the demographic who will just feel poorly for a couple of days. But there are other people with whom you might rub elbows who live with folks who are immunosuppressed, like my wife, or people who are undergoing chemotherapy and thus susceptible to disease, like a friend of mine, or people who fall into the over 70 bracket where the risks are highest. So it's not just you I'm worried about, it's the people you have contact with. To the extent that you can, take care of them too. All right, that's all for now. I'll see you guys in another couple of days.